Praised be Jesus Christ, His grace and His peace be with you. Many black Muslims today are leaving Islam because they feel despised as blacks. Even in a country among the less backward like Morocco, the society is divided by color and race. Recognizes the teacher Chowki El Hamel, author of The Black Morocco, A History of Slavery of the Race in Islam. He notes that in Morocco the political legitimacy and the freedom were linked to the whiteness, especially under the reign of Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur. And in the Haratines these blacks converted to Islam to escape the slavery were nevertheless been kept, especially during the reign of Sultan Moulay Ismail in the 17th century. In this way was perpetuated for the blacks whatever they are the status of slave. Moreover, slavery is still not officially abolished in Morocco by no decree of royal authority. And even if slavery as an institution has disappeared in Morocco, grace to French colonization, the racial contempt persists there for Haratines and of blacks in general. That some blacks have occupied of posts of responsibility does not prevent the majority of them having to fight against a racism which does then of entire villages of blacks are marginalized, deprived of social services and basic administrative. Mixed marriages between Arabs or Amazigh and blacks are always shameful in South Morocco. In short, how does Islam justify the racism towards blacks since he claims itself like being the perfect religion? This is what I offer you to find out now. In this video I will not talk with an exhaustive way of theme of slavery which Allah forbids. Moreover, the abolition, but to present the justification that gives Islam of its racism with the blacks. Justification which needed the Nas and Abbasid Empire to motivate their enslavement. This justification was forged by the much revered Muslim scholar Tabari in the 10th century, who following Ibn Hisham, the author of the first biography of Muhammad 2 centuries after his supposed existence, says that Shem, one of 3 sons of Noah, having been cursed by his father, has been condemned to be not only the slave of his brothers, but also to change color of skin, to turn black him and his descendants. And because Islam wants to remove to Christianity its divine legitimacy, and for that pretends refer itself to the same story as him, to the same revelation written in the Bible, this one uses the story of the curse of Ham which is told in the Bible in book of the Genesis, but the truth is that this curse would be the black color of the skin is not in the Bible. It is enough to be convinced to read the story of Cham in the book of the Genesis chapter 9, which shows if there were still need that the blasphemy is the foundation of Islam. Certainly Tabari was undoubtedly inspired rabbinic writings, who already does of the color of the black skin of curses of Cham. But these works do not bind not for all that clearly black skin color and slavery like did Tabari. And that is like that then the black association and slave hasn't disappeared from any Muslim country. In France also, species of a nigga, you dirty black, nobody touches you. Even with a stick, oh Allah, same with a finger and feet. I don't touch you, big dog. During 800 years we sold you like cattle, you bunch of prostitutes of shit. Do you hear him, us the Algerians? You are like of cattle, like of corn, bunch of bastards. He called him slave, he did him bleed. There's his blood laying there, Imam Dudi among others. Before being deported to Algeria in 2018 was preaching in the mosque the word of Allah. At the Mosque of Marseille is sauna that black people are dogs. In Muslim countries the expression Arabic abd, which means slave, always designates the black. And if the Muslim claims to be slave of Allah, he considers the black as slave of himself, Muslim. Slave by nature, as taught by the Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, that I quote to you. Most niggers become easily accustomed to servitude. This predisposition results of an inferiority, which brings them closer to animals. Oh, of course the Muslims will not miss here to tell the story here of first Muezzin Bilal ben Rabah, who was black and who would have been freed by Muhammad, but they will not say that Bilal was freed only at the condition of serving Muhammad. That means to integrate his band of criminals, acting under the cover and name of Allah. But, is it really a liberation to stop being a slave, to become it of Muhammad, who was himself slaver? And without doubt the worst slaver that be, since he managed to make people believe them to be subject to him and his epigoals. It was to be that to Allah himself, where we see that in the Quran the slayer of the associationism, this is to say of Christianity, was himself associator, but for good reason. The association is the law of the life. But above all, Allah is racist, and yes, how better to justify racism? Thus Allah says, I quote, on the day of the resurrection there will be of faces white and of black faces. Allah will say to them, go to taste the punishment for the price of your disbelief, while those whose faces will be white will receive the mercy of Allah. How to be black and Muslim. It should be noted that unlike to Christian missions, the first Muslims' conquests were not intended to convert people, but to raise them. Notice which doesn't make much of difference. This is why the Quran has a surah named the Budi. The Budi. To meet his needs for labor, Allah launched jihad. And once the people subdued, he left in place the potentates to the condition that they delivered to him every year a heavy toll of slaves. During the first Islamic expansion, the Arabs, who were on the war path, had decided to invade Egypt. After occupying this country, they also decided to invade the Nubia, the neighboring Nubia, and did this following a particularly bloody military campaign that the general and Emir Abdallah ben Said had already imposed in 652. What is called the Bukt, this means an agreement by which the vanquished African monarch undertook to deliver annually a batch of 360 captives, who were destined to be enslaved in the Arab Muslim world. But what is important is that you say that the slave trade and at the same time warriors' expeditions, led by Arab Muslims, have most devastated Africa. Then the transatlantic trades, indeed the slave trade, Arab Muslim, has been much more devastating than the transatlantic slave trade. We speaks of 17 millions just for the Sahara. It is estimated at 9 million the number of captives transported in absolutely inhuman conditions, which 2 millions have perished or remained on the edge of the desert. That from the 7th century. From the 7th century, but you say that it lasted 14 centuries. The castration was slightly less risky for the children, but in general this operation killed between 70 and 80% of captives. It is a real genocide. When from the 9th century the conquests began to become less frequent, the traffic caused by inhumanity of original sin, of lure of profits, but also without doubt of Stockholm Syndrome, has continued to operate and to prosper. The veil, in fact, that surrounds this sad page in our common history is due simply to a kind of solidarity religious you have between 400 and 500 millions of Muslims in Africa today. We have impression to witness a kind of syndrome from Stockholm to the African, where the Muslims intellectuals refuse to open the debate. The markets at slaves from the Orient stirred up a lot of money, and the Muslim sources and Christian insist on importance of role of Jews in this trade. It's sure, it's not just black people to have been enslaved by Muslims who consider themselves of an essence superior to other men. The Europeans have it too been very early, and this until in 1830. The French finally decide themselves to colonize North Africa. To say that the colonization she ended to slavery, I want to say Arab Muslim from 1848, and in Tunisia also, particularly the France ended to Arab Muslim slavery. We must denounce the Arab Muslim slave trade, which was much more long since it lasted more than 13 centuries without interruption and has deported many more people, but that the Tolerer Law of 2001 in the day of memories of the slave trade, of slavery, and of their abolition decided in 2005 by Jacques Chirac. Don't talk about it acknowledging for crimes against humanity. Only the Western slave trade. The whites as the only culprits. Because for Christian Taubira, do not mention the slave trade. Arab Muslim allows, I quote, to young Arabs not to wear on their backs all the weight of the inheritance of misdeeds of Arabs. You may have noticed that not only this statement amalgamates Arab and Muslim, and considers the young Muslims unable to come to terms with their history, unable to face the truth, but still bears witness to the degree of submission of our institutions to Islam, which has always been imposed by the falsification of the truth and the terror of where comes the idea to abolish slavery in the world from the Occident. Why? Because it was evangelized, and indeed alone the one God becomes man can to return to humanity their dignity. These are the so-called lights with its philosophers, like Voltaire, who preferring return to paganism of antiquity, of there the name of Renaissance, have resurrected slavery in Occident. If the trade they have organized has started at end of 15th century in Portugal and has been officially abolished 3 centuries later at Congress of Vienna of 1815, the slave trade Muslim lasted until under the Western pressure the public sale of slaves be prohibited in Saudi Arabia in 1962, in Oman in 1970, in Mauritania in 1981. But that the public sale of slaves is prohibited says nothing about their private sale. You have today in the Gulf countries, there is modern slavery which affects the Sinhalese, That affects the Indians. And the women African servants have their passports confiscated and suffer of treatments. This is of slavery. It's a form of slavery. And then there are of all that in the news teaches us that we organize. In this moment of markets of black slaves in Libya. 900, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000 and higher. 1,100, 1,100, 1,100. Four hundred, 500, 550, 600. The cases of bad treatments have multiplied, becoming so concerned that the government ended up banning last year sending of workers in the countries at risk, the Gulf and all, especially Saudi Arabia. My boss threw of Clorox on me and acid on the eyes. I told to my woman boss for 4 days that I wanted to go to hospital, but she didn't want to, and she said that I had to work, that I wanted or not, that I had to work. Sick or not, I began work at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I went to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning. Statistics are scarce, but according to some unions, more than 30 servants returned from Gulf in coffins in 5 years. Other victims of abuse come back traumatized like Anik. That's how they all consider the maids over there like slaves. They regard them as dogs. The fatwa enacted in 2003 by the very influential Saudi Saleh Al Fawzan is without ambiguity. Slavery is part of Islam like jihad, and that jihad will last as long than Islam. Of fact, to the unintentional murderer Muslim from another Muslim, in the absence of price of sank blood to the victim's family, Allah commands to set free a believing slave. So how to free a slave believing if there is no slave? Or the Quran is not the word of God, valid until the end of the world. And since there must be Muslims believing slaves, how to say that the conversion to Islam delivers from slavery? Only common point that I find between all these slave peoples is the religion. This is why I use the word Arab Muslim. I finished by noting that some black persons claim that Jesus himself would have been black, as well as all true Jews. It is sad to see in these words a feeling of inferiority, seeking compensation, but how much sadder is it still to see the message of Jesus always be so ignored and misguided in favor of racial claims or identity. Him who at price of his death and of his resurrection has us all blacks and whites reconciled with God. At price of his death and of his resurrection. If God made himself our brother, how to humiliate a man without humiliating God? If people knew that they are going to hell, they would give their life to Christ.